Yes.
All right. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Mohammed, and I'm doing a research paper on Islam and discrimination. And I have an interview with Imam Mazhar, and I have some questions to ask him.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm Imam Mazhar. I'm Muhammad's local Imam. I'm his Sunday school teacher as well. But right now in quarantine, I'm in Toronto, Canada. You can imagine how boring that might be. But it's always a good opportunity to interact with Muhammad and his colleagues. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you.
Assalamu alaikum. Okay. Inshallah, the first question will be, is Islam compatible with democracy? Why or why not?
Yeah, so see, that's a very broad question. I'll give you the crux of it. And in terms of Islam being compatible with democracy in a sense that we're living in the US as Muslims, I personally don't see anything wrong with that, although that in itself is a whole discussion. You find a number of schools of thoughts. And just like with Islam, you'll find a number of schools of thoughts with Christianity, Judaism as well. You take, for example, the Jews in Palestine, or what some people call Israel, the sort of a segment of the Jews which are more rational when it comes to their faith, or which are orthodox. They at times rebel against the government, and they don't even see, that political state to be a political state on religious grounds. You get what I'm saying? So in this case, you'll find Muslims, Muhammad, who might oppose the idea of democracy, but the vast majority, as you can tell with our presence in the US or Canada, or in other political democratic states, we find ourselves being there because we tolerate the fact that we're living in a democracy, and we understand that there is an acceptance of pluralistic ideas, regardless of your background. You just have to do your contributions, make your contributions to the society that you live in. And what I'm mentioning is actually the most middle path. And a lot of scholars have deduced this concept of democracy from the Quran as well, and the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is the biography of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as well. Allah says to the Prophet Muhammad in the Quran, in the 19th chapter of the Holy Quran, Allah says, وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ وَمِمَّا رَزَقْنَاهُمْ يُنْفِقُونَ. That among the qualities of the believers is that they have sort of a conversation in between them. Shura is consultation in between them. So that's what we're doing in democracy as well. So based on their consultation, decisions are made. And as you see in the seerah, in the biography of the second caliph of Islam, which is the second sort of leader after the Prophet Muhammad passed away, after the Prophet Muhammad came Abu Bakr, after him came Umar. When Umar was passing away, he basically got together a certain segment of the companions at that time who were linked directly with the Prophet Muhammad, and he told them, whatever the majority of you decide in reference to the next leader after my demise, and mind you, this is when he was on his deathbed, that person will be the leader. So whoever the majority of you decide regarding their leadership, that person will be the leader. So this is the first aspect that comes to mind when you say democracy. So in brief, Islam does tolerate democracy. In Canada, Muslims actually take benefits from the government, regardless of your financial status. Like, for example, I have a daughter. Regardless of how much I'm making in America as an imam or as a religious leader, the government gives the benefit to my child based on her mother, based on my wife, right? The government gives my child a child tax benefit. So why wouldn't Muslims be happy living in Canada as well when they're getting, a free check every month? So this is the first aspect that comes to mind with regards to democracy. The second aspect that comes to mind, and maybe some naive-minded people think that this may be contradictory to Islam in reference to democracy, is the practices which are passed by law. For example, Islam respects humanity, but there are certain practices that it does not condone. Yes, we are about pluralism. We have a broad sense of thought, so to speak, but there are certain aspects, say certain drugs which are legalized, that go against the practices of Islam, or say the aspect of homosexuality. We honor every human life, but the aspect of embracing homosexuality, does the law force you to do that? No, right? So what is our problem then with democracy once again? If these practices are passed through, say, consensus or through the majority, democracy in a state does not obligate you to do the actions, right, which it passes by a majority. So, for example, you're not obliged to smoke marijuana, right? Are you? You're not obligated to engage in homosexual actions if you don't wish to. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So there's no contradiction here as well. Well, people say there's interest which goes against Islam. There's, riba, interest, usury. That also goes against Islam. But there's interest in Muslim countries, man. What are you going to do? Right? This is life. If you really want to make a change, like many European countries have made a change by introducing some sort of Islamic legislations in their banking, if you really want to make a change, do it diplomatically, right? Write out a bill, show them the benefits of, say, the Islamic banking system. So show them a certain benefit of the Islamic lifestyle. If you really want that to be a part of, the law. Of course, we're not calling for a complete reformation of the secular law by making it Islamic law. But there are certain Islamic practices which can help democracy as well, the modern day democracy. I actually had an entire conversation about this with a group of lawyers who actually agreed with me. In Canada, when two people are not getting along, I'm sort of straying away here, but I'll end on this note for your first question. When two people are straying away from each other in a marriage, if there is no infidelity and if there's no abuse, they have to wait an entire year and deal with one another for an entire year before they get officially divorced. And I think, if I'm correct, it's the same in Canada. So I was talking to the lawyers and telling them that, look at the Islamic way of life. If there's justification that they're not getting along, and they wish to move on, they don't need to wait an entire year before just, by bearing to see each other's faces. They can just move on. So in both these aspects, I don't see a contradiction between Islam and democracy. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, like you said, there's like an oval shape, like an oval shape of Islam and an oval shape of democracy. Sure. And there's like a large intersecting area. There's a large intersecting area where you can live a whole life. Like you have a lifestyle in between that, right? But there's some things that Islam requires you to do that democracy doesn't force you to do, and vice versa.
Sure.
So there's Also, like while I was doing my research, there's a bunch of other people they did. Asked the amount of stuff, and some of them they had trouble between defining Islam as a lifestyle and or a governing system.
Of course. Yeah. A lot of scholars in the past have defined Islam as a lifestyle, and you see, even in the previous generations, there were great Muslims who lived in the non-Muslim lands at that time. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And a lot of the non-Muslim Muslim lands, even at that time, were founded on democratic rule and democratic practices. So to look at it from a spiritual lens, I would say there are some components of democracy even in Islam. Just, from the mere fact that the Quran recommends consultation and actions to be executed based on consultation and at times even the majority. So I would say there's a good premise for democracy in that regard as well.
But Islam doesn't require for Islam to be in the law, right? Like, as long as the law permits Islam to be
not necessarily, but if somebody, so now in Europe, and in South Africa, a large majority of the people are using the Islamic banking system, both Muslims and non-Muslims, because of the benefit that they see in it. So if even a non-Muslim introduces a legislation based on Islamic practices, uh, and that legislation is passed, or a Muslim for that matter does that, Islam doesn't have anything against that as well, if it's going to benefit the majority or if it's going to benefit the society, right? The mere crux of Islam is about preservation and not destruction. So that includes preservation of a political system as well.
All right. So the next question is, have you witnessed or experienced discrimination due to religious beliefs? Explain if you're comfortable with it.
You know how I like to keep the beard, right? Back in the days, my beard was very bushy. So once when I was walking to the masjid in Canada, somebody threatened me and said, "Hey, you terrorist, go back to your country," not knowing that my country is Canada. I was born in and raised in Canada. Nothing major, to be honest. This person, was an average threat. Sometimes people give you weird looks based on how you dress or how your wife or your mother is dressed with the hijab. But then again, I believe a lot has to do with mainstream media not doing its part in this regard as well. Rather, playing into the narrative of continuously abusing the minority based on how they look. If you look at, say, just the example of the hijab, you find certain segments of the Hindu community who wear the head cover. They don't call it hijab, of course. You find the Jewish community doing that. You find the Catholic nuns doing that as well. But the problem is, when it comes to Islam, the media oftentimes distorts the image of the hijab to be related to Islam. And I believe, and when I was there at your school giving that whole presentation, I believe this is great injustice, right? This is doing much damage. And we can see this damage through examples where, say, a Sikh person who has nothing to do with Islam is walking with their sort of turban and being called nasty names, being called, "Hey, you Muslim terrorist," for example, and being attacked in that regard. And there are many documented cases in the US where Sikhs, forget about Muslims being attacked, Sikhs were attacked for thinking that they were Muslims. The attacker thinking that they were Muslims. I personally haven't faced as much as discrimination as sort of the many people out there, but there was just a discriminatory case in your school not a while back. You must remember, right?
Oh, right.
Yeah. So there is definitely discrimination, but just because it's not subjective, meaning just because I have not faced discrimination, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
That's true. Yeah, they also had something at the ICP mosque. They wrote like 88 or some Hitler thing on the sign. Remember that? They did something like that. Yes. They did some vandalism. Okay, so kind of like to sum up the last.
Yeah, so you see mosques being vandalized.
Yeah.
One of the mosques actually near my previous vicinity was actually vandalized badly. But you see that a lot of people have good in them. So based on such actions, people might think now, all Muslims are out there to go against us. But you saw amazingly how that entire community mobilized, both Muslims and non-Muslims, and cleaned up the entire mosque, right? It was at the Cold Lake Masjid in Alberta. It was amazing to see that just as you can't paint all Muslims with the same brush based on, say, the actions of ISIS, you can't paint all non-Muslims with the same brush based on the vandalism and the discrimination that occurs in our society. There are many good people, and I would say the majority of the people give hope to humanity, and the majority of the people are good-hearted.
That's a good outlook. All right, so kind of like summing up the last few questions.
Sure.
you're an imam, so you must have like a lot of interactions, like with the youth, with people, like marriage counselors, all that kind of stuff. And you've traveled a bunch of places, so you've talked to other imams about this kind of stuff.
Of course.
So what's the most popular struggle with the Muslim youth concerning religious identity? And do you think that like this struggle that Muslim youth have, is it improving in the United States, or is it like getting worse?
So this is a loaded question, by the way.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a really loaded question. I'll try to summarize it. There are a few points to keep in mind. Is Muslim scholarship doing its part in connecting to the majority of the youth? Maybe in Peoria it is. MashaAllah, Sheikh Burhan is amazing when it comes to connecting with the youth. I myself have some sort of a connection to the youth as well through Sunday school and the programs that we do, or the informal sit downs at my office and pizza and whatnot, or meeting at Imad's house over a movie.
Yeah.
But the majority of the scholars, I'm hesitant to say, after looking at many communities, the majority of, say, Muslim scholarship is not doing their ideal part in connecting with the youth. And this is why you see a sort of a disconnect between the youth and the masjid, right? The youth and the mosque, the youth and community events, right? There needs to be sort of a compromise of your comfort as an elder when it comes to connecting with the youth. Have pizza parties with them, have movie nights with them, have different events with them. This is not happening at a major level. But do I see hope? Of course I see hope. A lot of the young scholars are sort of straying away from that circle of, rigidness. They're leaving that, even if they call that rigidness their comfort zone, they're leaving that just so they can connect with the youth in many communities. But just to bring about a small caveat here, I have seen in many other communities, there's also a lot of disregard with their youth, because I do a lot of interfaith. Believe it or not, I was once invited to a church to give an interfaith program, and that church was not a single denomination. It wasn't based on a single sect. What happened was, because of the lack of attendees, the youth sort of straying away from religion in that community. And I'm not surprised by that at all. What they had to do is they had to sell the other churches in that community.
Oh my God.
And people who literally were knockerheads with one another, people who literally did not get along with one another, had to congregate in one church. And that too are just a handful of people. So you see this happening in many communities, not just specific to the Muslim communities, where sort of the youth are being turned down. Another problem that, once again, I would say the faith community is facing is the rise of atheism. People are losing their faith, either because of the actions taking place by leadership in their circles, or because they can't reconcile some sort of their beliefs with what their teachings are. At an Islamic level, I believe, wallah, man, I take an oath that Islam is really rational in this regard. Many of these false assumptions that are out there among the youth, the Muslim youth regarding Islam, many of them could be tackled within a minute, to be honest. But people don't look at that. People don't resort to Islamic scholarship or genuine Islamic scholarship to find those answers. Sorry, I'm sort of rambling on. The brief answer is that, I see hope among the youth, and I don't see a total disconnect, although there is sort of a disconnect between the Muslim youth and scholarship as well.
Can you, with the Muslim youth, can you say how discrimination and their trouble with identity has been led to this decreased attendance in mosques and churches and stuff like that? Do you think
Yeah, so for sure. Sometimes this aspect is related to a cultural clash between them and their parents. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So a lot of what their parents teach them, Islam in the name of culture, I should say. You get what I'm saying? So automatically they have a disconnect, because one person's culture is not compatible with another person's culture. One person's preferences is not compatible with another person's preferences. If they were to teach Islam for Islam, for what Islam actually represents, then, the Muslim youth wouldn't struggle with that portion of their identity. You get what I'm saying? They wouldn't
Yeah.
struggle with what they think through their parents Islam is. They wouldn't struggle with that if Islam was being taught as Islam, so to speak. At the end of the day, I think most of the identity crises that we see among youth, I can narrow a lot of it down because of lack of time. I can narrow a lot of it down to what we may term as peer pressure from family or irrational cultism or culturalism that is taught to them by their parents or their sort of group, may it be a country that they're affiliated with or an ideology that they may be affiliated with, not Islam. Sorry, I think there's some issues happening.
Oh, I can still hear you, so it's good at least.
Okay.
Right.
So it's not Islam in itself. I narrow it down to the cultism that they're being taught.
Right, and this is actually like what you're saying is actually like backed by my research. So you're giving me like good juicy details,
All right, that's good. Amazing.
Yeah, so last question before we go to comments. Do you think that the general perspective of non-Muslims towards Muslims is changing? Like, do you think like non-Muslim people are looking at Muslim people in a different light? And is it getting better or is it getting worse?
Once again, that's another can of worms. Depends on the region that you're in.
In the U.S.
Even in the U.S., sometimes you're in regions which are, heavily backed by the whole Republican mentality. Others are more democratic. Others are just, free-minded. They want nothing to do with these ideologies, each to their own. But I would say if you look at it at a general level, people are sort of becoming understanding of Islam, especially after a lot of contemporary research which is given thought. Like, for example, the Quran of Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, he had a Quran.
Really?
Yes, so this is now, coming to the forefront. So people are sort of changing their mentality about Islam. Well, if Islam was a ruthless religion, why would one of our forefathers hold value to the Islamic religious book? And then the early Muslim newcomers, which were brought from Africa as slaves, that is coming to the forefront. Muslims who are in the US political system, who are doing amazing work out there, their actions are coming to the forefront. Your doctors, your lawyers, your engineers who are bringing stability to your society, your community, they're at the forefront, especially nowadays, with the whole COVID-19 pandemic. You see a lot of the doctors in Peoria are from the Islamic background, including your father, right? They are the heroes of the forefront. They are the heroes at the forefront right now. They are the heroes of the time. So a lot of these aspects, when it comes to surface, then people change their mentality. And sometimes you don't blame the general public for their thoughts, their negativities towards Islam. We have a bigger culprit out there. And I would put a lot of blame once again on institutions like, say, Fox News, who are always rambling, right, about the negativities of Islam or Muslims by looking at the 0.6%, right, of Islam. Say, they're talking about ISIS and giving ISIS an image, basically portraying as if that is what the majority of Islam is. So I put a lot of blame in that sector. But in terms of the general public, I believe when we think with rationality, when we meet our Muslim neighbors, when we meet with one another over a cup of coffee, that is enough to do for the preservation of rationality and the preservation of social stability for the generations to come.
Okay, thank you for the interview. If you have any more comments or ideas or anything you want to talk about discrimination or Muslim identity, anything like that. take his time.
So in your context, I would say you guys are pretty diverse, right? At your school?
Yeah, Dunlop High
So
School is really diverse.
people have Muslim friends. I would basically just advise one and all to carry on that whole sort of friendship even after they graduate, not become closed-minded once you go to university. Because sometimes when you become engrossed, say you're getting into medicine or philosophy, when you become engrossed to certain terminologies or certain principles that you're learning, you sort of block off your mind from being open towards others as you were, say, in high school or prior to that. So I would just say live your life with an open mind. I personally had a lot of problems in this regard as well. When I was studying, I studied based on a specific mentality, a specific theology. And what that did to me is it made me really close-minded towards others after I graduated. Until I was forced to think with an open mind after I went through some trials and tribulations. That's when I said, well, people are generally not so bad out there. Just gotta do your thing, live and let live, and just love and be loved. That's it.
That's a good message, a good positive message. All right, I think we're good for the interview.
All right. Take care. It was nice. It was a nice opportunity. Sorry if I rambled a little bit. Quarantine really got to me. I've been in quarantine for about 20 days, but it was a nice conversation. I hope the masses benefit as well.
Yeah, thank you for the interview.
All right. Thank you, Mohammed. Salam alaikum.
All right, assalamu alaikum.